Hello, third year students. The title of this lecture is Crusoe's First Voyage. Students, would you please go to page 8, the second paragraph, in which Robinson Crusoe continues narrating his own story to us, saying, "It was not till almost a year after this that I broke loose, though in the meantime I continued obstinately deaf to all proposals of settling to business, and frequently expostulated with my father and mother about their being so positively determined against what they knew my inclinations prompted me to." Students, last time we said that Robinson Crusoe has promised his father not to go to sea and be a sailor. He has surrendered to his father's will and decided to be a lawyer. By doing so, he has made up his mind to live a life of a middle class, a life that makes him be away from adventures, and a life of peace and security. But Crusoe, the obstinate young man, is full of ambition and wishes. He cannot help thinking of achieving these wishes that push him to ride the sea. After a year, Crusoe could not keep his promise to his father. He shows a great tendency to make a voyage, since he has now found the chance to do it. So let us see how he is going to make his first voyage. But being one day at Hull, where I went casually and without any purpose of making an elopement at that time, but I say being there, and one of my companions being going by sea to London in his father's ship, and prompting me to go with him, with the common allurement of seafaring men that it should cost me nothing for my passage, I consulted neither father nor mother any more, nor so much as send them word of it. Being in Hull, Robinson Crusoe has met a friend, coincidentally, who tells him that he is going to sail to London by his father's ship. He encourages Crusoe to join him to London. Crusoe, who is seeking a chance to ride the sea, does not refuse this invitation, since it will cost him nothing. Without thinking of the consequences of this voyage, Crusoe has accepted his friend's offer. Students, we are still discussing page 8, in which Crusoe continues his narration, saying, "And in an ill hour, God knows, on the 1st of September, 1651, I went on board a ship bound for London. Never any young adventurer's misfortunes, I believe, began sooner or continued longer than mine. The ship was no sooner gotten out of the Humber than the wind began to blow and the sea to rise in a most frightful manner, and as I had never been at sea before, I was most inexpressibly sick in body and terrified in mind. I began now seriously to reflect upon what I had done, and how justly I was overtaken by the judgment of heaven for my wicked leaving my father's house and abandoning my duty." Students, as you see here, Crusoe has described the time of making his decision to travel as an ill hour. Underline these words, because later we are going to discuss them. Okay, as you see here, Crusoe says that on the 1st of September 1651, he joins his friend sailing to London, forgetting his promise to his father not to ride the sea. Being very happy to make his first voyage, Crusoe is shocked by the terrible weather that makes him think seriously of his rash decision to ride the sea. The wind blows, the waves begin to rise, the sea starts showing his agitation and anger, and Crusoe has found himself lost. He does not know how to keep himself secure. Indeed, he is now terrified and does not know what he should do. Crusoe's fear makes him regret. He realizes his mistake of leaving his home and abandoning his secure life. He realizes that neglecting his father's advice is a great mistake he has committed. Students, how do you see Robinson Crusoe here? What kind of a young man he is? Why does Crusoe describe his voyage as an ill hour? Let us discuss all these things. Crusoe here looks selfish, and his selfishness or self-interest makes him face many troubles. His decision to travel abroad is not based on his reason, but rather on his passion. He has ignored his father's advice and strongly followed his inclinations to make adventures and ride the sea. In addition to his selfishness, Crusoe's rush and conceit led him to face many misadventures and to confront danger and sometimes death itself. Crusoe, who seems to be drawn by his dreams and wishes, becomes aware that he has been following an illusion. He himself has concluded that his decision to leave his home, his family, and friends and ride the sea is done in an ill hour, which means it is not the right decision. What leads Crusoe to say so? The voyage ends with a shipwreck, but Crusoe and all the seafaring men have been survived. So why he has described the time of starting this voyage as an ill hour or evil hour? Crusoe has said that his first voyage is done in an evil hour or ill hour because it is this voyage that leads him to make more voyages, which ultimately lead him to his tragic end, which is being cast away in a deserted island and living alone there 28 years. At the same time, Crusoe has used this description because he is narrating to us as readers, of course, events that have occurred before. In other words, Crusoe here is writing his diary, a diary that has been written while he is on the remote island alone. This is why he has found that riding the sea in his first voyage is done in an ill hour. Students, let us go now please to page 10, the last narrative paragraph, in which Crusoe continues narrating events and describing the anger of the sea and the violent storm, saying, "By this time it blew a terrible storm indeed, and now I began to see terror and amazement in the faces even of the seamen themselves. The master, thou vigilant in the business of preserving the ship, yet as he went in and out of his cabin by me, I could hear him softly to himself say several times, Lord, be merciful to us, we shall be all lost, we shall be all undone, and the like. I thought the bitterness of death had been past, and that this would be nothing too like the first, but when the master himself came by me, as I said just now, and said we should be all lost, I was dreadfully frightened." The narration of Robinson Crusoe here shows that time passes and it brings with it more danger and threat. Crusoe has found himself living a real terror and threat. He starts seeing this terror and danger in the faces of the seafaring men, who seem very confused and shocked. They try to do all their best to save themselves and to preserve the ship, and at the same time to make it out of danger. Crusoe keeps watching the horrible scene without knowing when it will come to an end. His anxiety and fear have been increased by the words of the captain of the ship, who keeps calling God to help them, since they have lost control over everything. Students, we're still discussing page 10, the last paragraph, in which Crusoe continues describing his fear and the dangerous events he has lived, saying, I got out of my cabin and looked out, but such a dismal sight I never saw. The sea went mountains high and broke upon us every 3 or 4 minutes. When I could look about, I could see nothing but distress round us. 2 ships that rid near us we found had cut their masts by the road, being deep laden, and our men cried out that a ship which rid about a mile ahead of us was founded. 2 more ships, being driven from their anchors, were run out of the roads to sea at all adventures, and that with not a mast standing. The narration of Robinson Crusoe here shows that the situation on the ship is very difficult. It is not easy for the professional seaman to keep the ship out of danger. The agitated sea threatens to destroy the ship every minute. The sailors become aware that death is approaching and they cannot escape it. It is difficult for them to resist the high waves of the sea that have destroyed other ships which are near them. Destruction and death seem to be inevitable, and no way to escape them, even cutting the masts of the ship. Crusoe has found himself here, unable to do anything. He keeps frightfully watching this horrible scene. However, the storm was so violent that I saw what is not often seen: the master, the boatswain, and some others more sensible than the rest at their prayers, and expecting every moment when the ship would go to the bottom. In the middle of the night, and under all the rest of our distresses, one of the men that had been down on purpose to see cried out we had sprung a leak. Another said that there was 4 foot water in the hold. Then all hands were called to the pump. At that very word, my heart, as I thought, died within me, and I fell backwards upon the side of my bed, where I sat, into the cabin. Students, you can find this narration in the last paragraph of page 11. Here, Crusoe, who is watching the scene, says that the violent storm makes him see nothing save fear and mess on the ship. The captain and his assistant seem more aware of things on the ship and around them than others. They expect that the ship would be founded, and their prayers prove that they have nothing to do save watching the horrible scene and waiting. At night, things become more worse than before. Crusoe and his friends have heard one of the sailors crying that they have sprung a leak, which means that part of the ship had been destroyed and water covers part of it. They need to do something before the ship being founded, so they have to pump in order to get water out of it. The shock and the sight of sailors running to preserve the ship horrify Crusoe, who hopelessly looks round him, trying to do something, but he seems unable to save himself or even to help others in doing something. Students, let us go now to page 12, in which Crusoe's fear and anxiety come to an end. He and all the seafaring men have been saved by another ship. Describing this, Crusoe says in the second paragraph, we were not much more than a quarter of an hour out of our ship, But we saw her sink, and then I understood for the first time what was meant by a ship foundering in the sea. I must acknowledge I had hardly eyes to look up when the seamen told me she was sinking, for from that moment they rather put me into the boat than that I might be said to go in. My heart was as it were dead within me, partly with fright, partly with horror of mind and the thoughts of what was yet before me. Students, as you see here, the first voyage or adventure of Robinson Crusoe ends with failure. It ends with the sinking of the ship, but Crusoe and the seamen have reached the shore all safe. Crusoe himself has gained nothing here save fear, anxiety, and distress. After surviving the horrible end, Crusoe meets the captain of the ship, who is the father of his friend. This man knows that Crusoe has made this voyage without consulting his parents, so he warns him against his deed, saying, "You ought never to go to sea any more. You ought to take this for a plain and visible token that you are not to be a seafaring man." Students, you can find this quotation in page 13, the third paragraph. Here, the captain of the ship gravely warns Crusoe against his behavior. He tells Crusoe not to ride the sea again. Riding the sea will make Crusoe gain nothing save disasters and disappointments. Now, how does Daniel Defoe portray the danger that Crusoe has confronted in his first voyage? Students, this will be your homework. Students, thank you very much for your listening.